There is tons of advice on product management and what you should do and what's important. Literally hundreds of things that say the top 7 skills you need, and far be it from me to introduce yet another, all the things you need to know to be a product manager. But so this isn't a proposition for that. This is the thing that I use most every day to remind me of what I think is important and what I should do. So this is just what I think the product manager role should bring. What are the key skills? You'll notice communication is there twice. We can talk about that, and what attributes you need to have. So this is just my own reminder, and the topic that I want to talk to you about tonight is how the product manager can empower the team and why that is important and how you can go about doing that. The subtext to this is that the product manager role, which is a thing they don't often tell you when you start, is that you are accountable for the team's outputs, which means you have to answer for what the team does, but you are not in charge of the team. Once again, you are accountable, but you are not in charge. So yeah, this is, and it's a really interesting paradox. I actually spent a lot of time looking up, like, how do you deal with it when you're accountable, but you're not in charge? And the only advice I could find is to never, ever do that. Yet, as we'll talk about, effectively that is what the product manager role is. So we have an interesting conundrum to explore, and that's what I want to explore with you tonight. Okay, let's dive in. So basically this is the agenda. I'll just sort of introduce myself so you just have a sense of my background. Then secondly, I want to talk about why teams are important and why I think we underestimate the importance of teams. Secondly, I want to talk about this idea that people put out there that as the product manager, you're the CEO of the product. There's a lot of debate back and forth. I have a rather strong view, but we could debate that. Thirdly, then I want to talk about, given the two things that we've just discussed, how do you then apply that to working with a cross-functional team? All right, let's dive in. So this is about me. So I have been around, I think it's fair to say. I moved to London in 2009. I started contracting in 2011. So I've moved roughly every year to a different organization just to take new contracts. I'm currently at GDS. I've been at 2 startups. These are the startups. That was a health startup, and this was in academic research. I was at the BBC. You might have heard of that. I was at HSBC, which is a bank. I was at Reed Business Information. This was my first contract. And then my very first product role in about 2007 was at Lonely Planet, which is a travel guide publisher. That was my introduction. I transitioned. I was a delivery manager. Back then we called them product managers, but then I moved into product. I've also founded a consultancy focused on software teams, which is called Next Team. You wouldn't have heard of us because we've just founded. So that's my background. I've worked in quite a few different sectors, as you can probably see. So I've been on digital identity, which is what I work on for GDS. I've been in pure e-commerce, digital art, that was the BBC role. I've done a lot of work on internal tools, which is, you could argue, a separate category of product management. I've done quite a bit of publishing, and I've also done digital or agile transformations. I've always worked in cross-functional teams. The sizes range and the functions range, but it's anywhere from 3 people to 30. I've been in situations where I've had one team that I focus on exclusively, and I've also managed 2 or sometimes 3 teams at a time, which becomes progressively less fun the more teams you manage. In terms of titles, I've bounced around. My titles have been product owner all the way up to director of product. Sadly, sometimes I'm at director of product and then I go back down to product owner, and I feel like I've taken a big step backwards, but that's not actually what's happened. But on contract, it tends to be harder. You tend to take different roles. So I try not to get too caught up in the title. But anyways, those are the titles that I've had. And that's my background. Okay, so let's come on to the importance of teams and why I think the importance of teams is underestimated. So here's the slide that you were looking at before. So I just went through my background, and when I think about the different roles that I've had, and I try to assess, well, which ones of these would I consider successful? Like we delivered the outcome that the business wanted, or just would I personally consider it a success? Am I happy with what we did? Well, quite a few of them, happily. Those are the ones that I would consider successful. And these are the ones that I would consider not successful. Or in some cases, you might just say they were a total abysmal failure. That was particularly this one. I don't really want to remember that one much. Some of them were sort of successful and then not successful. And I've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about, well, what was it I always feel like I do the same things. I'm the same person, I have the same skills, I try to apply those skills for the good of the business. Why does it work sometimes and other times it doesn't work? And for a long time I couldn't, I thought, well, I sort of tried out a lot of different arguments. And what I've come to is that the strongest correlation I can find between the reds and the greens is the actual team that I'm a part of at that business and the agency that I have to affect that team, either by changing the way they work or changing the composition of the team or bringing in new people to introduce the team. Again, the correlation is where I've had control of the team, well, control is the wrong word, where I've been able to influence the team, where I've been a part of where I've joined an existing team that was good and working well, the outcomes tended to be much better. Where I have not been able to do that, the outcomes tended to be not as good. That was quite a revelation for me. I think probably a couple years ago was when I actually came to that. So thinking about that more, particularly the role that I had at Digital Science, this was an internal startup at Macmillan Publishers. What I went there to do was to actually do an Agile transformation for them. And as part of that transformation, I spent a year and a half focusing on the process of software development at that company. And we were trying to get them to move towards Agile. Effectively, they were working in a completely uncontrolled, disorganized fashion. And surprisingly, it wasn't working that well. So we tried to introduce some Agile process. Are you guys all familiar with Agile? Like, do we have, okay. Is anyone not familiar with that? And it's okay, we can talk about it. Well, we can talk about it later, but we all work in Agile now. So the job was to introduce Agile to this company. So I spent a year and a half trying to introduce processes like having a stand-up, writing user stories, working in iterations, the Agile Manifesto, trying to introduce all of that. And at first it worked well, and then it kind of stopped working well. And by the time I left, I would say that, yes, the organization transformed, but it wasn't revolutionized, and the organization wasn't fundamentally more successful. And so I felt like, for me, that wasn't ultimately a success. And in talking about it with the people I worked with at the time, we've come around to the view that if we were going to do it again, instead of focusing on the team's working processes, what we probably would have done, and which would have been cheaper and more effective and much faster, is hire a couple of different people and put them on the teams. So rather than focus on the mechanics of software development, we would have hired a couple of experienced product managers and maybe a tech lead or two. We would have put individuals in specific places to affect change within the teams and let influence the rest of the teams to change their working behavior. And I suspect in 6 months we would have seen much more change than we saw trying to change the way the team worked. That was a revelation for me related to this revelation, which suddenly I thought, for 6 years, I think I've been focusing on the wrong thing. These are some quotes I found about teams. I suspect there is a thing happening very slowly and probably not visibly where the way the organization thinks about teams and individuals is changing. I can't prove that, I don't know that for certain, but I suspect there is. The quote that resonates with me most is, have you heard of Adam Grant? He's a guy who works at Google and now has a podcast and thinks that because he worked at Google, everyone should listen to his podcast, which is a little bit annoying. But I do have some time for this quote. Start treating teams, not individuals, as the fundamental building block of the organization. It actually makes a lot of sense. Like, when we think about solving a problem, we think, oh, I got to get a user researcher and a product manager, and we got to get individuals and put them together as a team. But sometimes it takes 3 to 6 months to put together a team. Sometimes the team doesn't gel. Sometimes the team is average. Sometimes the team is great. Who knows? There's a lot of risk associated with that. So I think there's something in this. I can't prove it, but it aligns with my personal experience and what I've come to believe is important about teams. This one is interesting. Deloitte wrote this. I don't have a lot of time for Deloitte personally, but we know their name. A new organizational form is on the rise, a network of teams. Could be true. I've spent a lot of time trying to find evidence about the difference between good teams and average teams or bad teams. My own personal experience with good teams and average teams and bad teams is that good teams deliver way more than average teams. Like, not just a little more, not double, orders of magnitude. Is that your experience as well if you manage multiple teams? So I tried to find some evidence for this. It's actually quite thin on the ground. So Google has a project, you may have heard of it. It's called Project Aristotle, where they studied, you can see this, 2 teams, 180 teams over 2 years, 37,000 people. What they were trying to figure out is what makes good teams good and what makes average teams average. This is what they actually found. But what's interesting to me is not that what they found, but that they noticed such an extreme disparity in the efficiency and the production of teams that they spent all that time studying it. The other interesting that they found is their original assumption was good teams would be formed of all sort of rock stars. I hate that term, but I can't think of a better one right now. And what they found is that has nothing to do with it. It's not like, they have this idea of hire 10x developers and put them all together. That actually had nothing to do with the performance of teams. There was no correlation between high performance and the sort of perceived quality of the individuals on the team. It was completely different. That was a great finding. But yeah, again, what was interesting to me is that this suggests there was a really extreme disparity in performance of teams, and they couldn't figure out why, so they needed to study that. It's not just me saying that a good team is order of magnitudes more efficient than average teams. The Serbian Journal of Management says it. That's literally the only other evidence I could find. Their evidence said that, on average, a highly effective software team is eight times more efficient than an average one. I think this was published in 1974. I really don't know how much to put in it. And I don't know. So I don't know anything about the Serbian Journal of Management. I just thought it was interesting that it was published there. And in fact, even Google hasn't they put out the results of that study, but they haven't put out the data about how much more efficient the good teams are than the average ones. So it's a little hard to find evidence to say that, but it does align with my personal experience with lots of different teams, that the ones that are good are just not just a little bit more, but way, way more efficient. So let's just recap the bit about teams. So good teams deliver not just a little more, but a lot more. I forgot to mention this, but in my personal experience, being on a good team is just so much more fun. It is so much better, and you learn so much more. So like just from a personal standpoint, it's just way better for your career, and it's way better to go into the office. And as a product manager, your success is entirely dependent on the team. You're never going to be working in a product role where you're not working with the team. And you can't succeed. I mean, like it was mentioned before, but you can't get anything done without the team. So you have to think about the team, and you have to think about much more carefully about the team than I ever, for 6 years, I thought I was thinking about the team, and I realized now I wasn't even scratching the surface of it. So that's the bit about teams, and that's the recap of that. So, second topic. As the product manager, are you the CEO of the product? I think that when we hear the term CEO of the product, it connotes these kinds of visions, power poses, a team rapidly waiting for words to drip out of your mouth, words of wisdom, and then wearing sunglasses at the stand-up. I think we are absolutely not the CEO of the product, and we should never power pose like that. I think we should not expect the team to rapidly listen to the words that we say, and we definitely shouldn't wear sunglasses at the stand-up, although if we have a disability, that can, we accept that. So firstly, I just think this inaccurately describes the job. It does not match at all with what I think the reality on the ground is for most product managers. Obviously, we're near as senior as the CEO, and you do not have formal authority that the CEO has. The CEO tends to have hiring and firing power and the ability to somewhat make things happen with some words. As we'll come to, you have the ability to make things happen with words, but in a different way. And we'll talk about that. The worst part of this is that I think it encourages a non-constructive kind of behavior, because I think if you think you're meant to be the CEO of the product and you try to act like that, over time you will be progressively less effective. You will lose the team. So I think it discourages the most constructive kind of behavior as a product manager, and that's actually why I mention it, not just to put up some funny pictures. So yeah, I strongly oppose the idea of the CEO as the product. I actually think the CEO role is more like a product manager than the reverse, but we can talk about that after because it's off topic. So as a product manager, you are not an individual contributor, and if you act like an individual contributor, you will lose the team, but you are also not a manager. And if you act like a manager, I would posit that you will also lose the team. But it does raise the question, if you're neither of those, then what are you? So anyways, the question is, if you're not an individual contributor and if you're not a manager, then what are you? I think what you are, is an influencer. Sorry, that brings up social media connotations, and I don't mean that. But I think product management is an influence job, and it's somewhere in the middle. It's more than individual contributor, but you don't have the delegated authority of the manager. I actually think of influence somewhat as a currency, that I have some influence as a product manager, and when I'm approaching decisions that I might make or problems that the team is encountering, I try to think about the level of influence I have and how the way I'm approaching the problem might affect that level of influence. Like, as an example might be, we have a division with the team or a debate about one of two directions. Well, we could resolve it by me just saying, well, this is the direction we're going. That generally results in a bit of a hit to your influence because people won't agree and there'll be some grumbling. They'll probably get over it, but you've reduced your influence a little bit. And if you continue to reduce it, your job becomes harder. That's why if you're a CEO or you're an individual contributor, your influence goes down over time and your job becomes harder, and eventually you literally can't do the job. So I think it's a good idea to think about your influence as a currency. There's also ways of getting decisions made which increase your influence, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, so another recap. So the first point is that the team is essential to our success. And the second point is we're an influence role and we are not in charge. Okay, so the question I was going to ask is, you're in an influence role, the team is really important, you're not in charge, what do you do? Well, what I think I used to not do, and I now have started to do, is empowering the team and setting boundaries and context. So empowering the team, I mean, it sounds really obvious. Well, of course, we would all want to empower the team. In general, if you ask people, would you like to be on an empowered team? Do you think it's important? Most people would say, yeah, that's pretty important. We should do that. What I think is rare is for it to actually happen. I think that's abundantly rare. I don't know if you've heard of Marty Kagan. He wrote a famous product book 10 years ago, and he works for Silicon Valley Product Group. He talks a lot about empower teams, and he did some study about actual empowerment of teams, and it's hardly any. So why is it rare? If we all think in principle it's a good idea, but in practice we hardly ever do it, and I include myself in that. In my previous roles I thought I was doing it, I most definitely was not. Why is it rare? Well, I guess I can only speak for myself, but the reason why it was rare are these. I was asking myself these questions. Well, what if the team makes a mistake? What if they go off and work on tech debt for 3 weeks? What if I give them control and they actually do it better, right? Also, I thought, well, I'm the product manager. I should have all the answers, right? Will they listen to me, right? If I don't have control, will they not do what I say? I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. You're like, I know this. This is my thing. I'm good at this. And we don't have time. This is a classic one. We don't have time to argue about this. We just need to get some stuff done. All these questions were running through my mind, right? And this is what they were. They were fears, right? I didn't know it, I only know this in hindsight, but I was genuinely afraid to relinquish control to the team for those reasons. So, having thought about it a lot in my role at GDS, I have learned a bit to do it differently. I can't say that I've mastered it, and I can't say that it's always worked, but I guess that's when I want to talk to you about it now. So, the summary is you have to relinquish some control, and it's hard, and it's scary. I don't think those questions go away. You just have to learn to say, well, I'm going to try it anyways, right? I'm going to see what happens. The key is thinking about relinquishing control, but putting boundaries and context around it. And I don't think that's a science. I think that's an art. That's communication and interpersonal skills and patient repetition. But let's talk a bit more about it. So this is the slide I hate the most about this talk because it's just a laundry list of stuff. But I can't think of a better way to describe to you what I personally did, and it worked so much better that I thought it was worth having this talk about. So what did I do? Well, instead of saying what the team should do, I set some boundaries, and I just let the team choose. I genuinely let the team choose the direction. And the genuinely bit is it's hard, is that you can think, well, I'm going to let the team choose the direction, but what if they choose a direction that is not the one that you thought was the right one? Immediately you face those questions like, well, wait, I'm the product manager. I should know this. This is my field. this is the direction I think we should go. Well, you have to genuinely let them choose a direction, right? It doesn't mean it's unfettered, and it doesn't mean you don't talk about it, and it doesn't mean you don't set boundaries, but it does mean you genuinely have to listen to the team. And it sounds obvious, but I think in practice it's hard, and that's why everybody says we should empower teams, but hardly anybody does it, because it requires genuinely relinquishing stuff that's hard to let go of. And I count myself as like the #1 offender of that. I just stopped having, like, I had opinions, but I stopped saying them, because it's like, I think the button is green, I think it's better when it's green, right? I think when you click that, you should go, like, who cares, right? It's evidence. That I focus on evidence, and if I didn't have evidence, I pretty much never offered an opinion. I'll tell you what I did instead, but I just backed off having opinions. I focus on facilitating consensus for decisions, and we talked about the currency of influence, and this is a key thing. When you facilitate consensus to a decision, rather than just say, this is what I've decided and here's what we're going to do, your influence goes up, right? If you say, here's what we're going to do, you risk your influence going down. And not unilaterally, but it probably will. When you get to consensus, and particularly if you facilitated it and the team can perceive that, your influence tends to go up. In my experience, in the last 2 years, the team has made, I would say, 80% of the decisions. But I've ratified them. And by ratify, I don't mean, go ahead. I mean saying, like, okay, well, it seems like we all agree. Are we all happy to proceed on that basis? Yep, okay, great. Ratified. So as the product manager, I wasn't the decision maker, I was the decision ratifier. Except for 20% of the time, I made decisions, but I always had the team ratify them. So, okay, we've talked about it a lot. We seem to be at loggerheads. I think it would be best to go in this direction for these reasons. Are we all happy with that? No? Okay, let's talk about it some more. Yep, great, let's do that. That's a decision. So you can make this, by ratifying, it's sort of it's gentle, it's not the CEO model. When problems arise, as they inevitably do, I stopped trying to jump in and solve them myself. I only jumped in to solve things when it was sort of absolutely required, and I was the person in the best place to do it. But my first instinct was to jump in and do it myself. My first instinct now is, who on the team can solve this? Who can I ask for help? And that really brought the team. I realized in hindsight that I was cutting the team out of a lot of stuff they needed to know and depriving them of the ability to participate fully. And I was just trying to do stuff, right? In my mind, I was just like, let's make things happen, let's move quickly. What I was actually doing is I was disempowering the team. I completely got out of the business of caring about Agile and Kanban, right? I was just like, unless it affects the product that we're building, work however you want, right? If we're ineffective, yes, we'll talk about it, right? If I think it's affecting the product, if I think there's an issue, I'll raise it. But it's not, you choose how if you want to work in Kanban, great, let's talk about that. If you want to do Agile, great. 1 week iterations, 2 week iterations, fine. You decide, right? If it affects the product, then we'll talk about that. That's an example of the boundary, right? Within that boundary, I'm happy for them to do it. I'm happy for them to, they should decide. One thing off my plate. I let others speak first. I realized that I was often the first person to say, and I would often offer an opinion like, hey, I think this button is, it's looking really good. When it's green, it's great. What do you guys think? I never do that anymore. I'm just like, what do you guys think of the button? And if the quiet members of the team didn't say anything, well, okay, what do you think? What do you think, quiet developer over in the corner? It's really important to let the quiet, you always have quiet people on the team and people are outspoken, and you really need to balance out those outspoken people. And I never went first, I always went last. When you go last, you can put the boundary around it, right? Like, okay, we've all had our say. It seems like we think that the button should be green. Are we happy with that? Yes, decision. The team loves that. As we talked about, when the time came to change the composition of the team, I didn't really shy away from that. It doesn't mean that I could always do it or I always had the ability to do it, but I've just thought really carefully about who was on the team and do we have the right people on the team and do we need to change that? Do we need to move people around to other teams? Do we need to reskill? It wasn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and it wasn't just like you make one mistake, you're gone. But it was just making sure I was really cognizant of that, because there are times when it just isn't working, you need to change it. But if there's one thing that I changed, if there was only going to be one thing that I talked about in terms of what I changed, my first instinct, if I'm going to speak, I'm going to ask questions. I'm not going to say stuff. because that just opens up the room for, and these are like my classic questions. Sometimes it was because I genuinely had this question, other times I just didn't know what to say, right? So how would that affect this thing? Okay, great. Well, how does that align with our priorities? You want to do 3 weeks of tech debt. How does that work with our priorities? Does it work with our priorities? Why do you think that is? Do you agree? What do you recommend is a great one? Like when you get to the end and you don't know, okay, team, what do you recommend? Quite often, when you do that, you'll get silence for a while. It's amazing, right? And then you ask it again, what do you want to do? And they're thinking, well, wait, you're the product manager, just tell us what to do. You're like, no, I'm not going to tell you what to do. What do you recommend? It really starts to put, the team gets used to that, but when you do it first, it's quite interesting. Would everyone agree with that is interesting. It brings out the quieter members. Or sometimes, do you agree with that, Martin? This is a good one. So do we have some evidence for that, right? It's a way of highlighting what is personal opinion from what is objectively true, right? Because that happens a lot, right? I think it should be this way. Okay, not I disagree with you, but what evidence is there? Sometimes there is, right? And you don't know about it. So the main change I made is I just asked a ton of questions. I was always asking the team questions, and I was always trying to facilitate. I was trying to move us towards decisions. And if they didn't get made, I would be happy to. Sometimes I would say, it seems like we're stuck. Do you want me to make the decision? Would it help if I just made the decision, right? That's a way of breaking through that. If the team says yes, you're good. Your influence goes up, right? If you don't ask that, there's a bit of a risk there. So when I did all this, my teams at GDS, what happened? Well, it sounds it sounds too good to be true, and I'm still kind of amazed, but it was amazing. That's why I'm here talking about this. We got all sorts of ideas. The team that I was on was called service optimization. We're basically A/B testing and trying to launch features to improve the service I was doing. All sorts of new ideas that I never would have thought of those ideas. Never, ever. Some of them were from developers, the developers' friends, ideas came out of the woodwork. A lot of them were bunk, right? But we did stuff that I would never have, was not on my roadmap. I would not have been able to predict. I never would have suggested, right? So getting more ideas resulted in us doing different things, and some of those things worked, right, in ways that I wouldn't have predicted. So that was great for me. That was fantastic. The team was obviously happier, and you could tell it in the retros, you could tell it in the feedback we got. We delivered so much more. I can't even describe how much more we delivered, but it was. The missions were perceived as successful by management, which is not something we should ignore. But the feedback was wow, your teams are really getting a lot done. You've launched a feature that actually worked. It's kind of amazing. Yeah, it is amazing. The results were incredibly positive. But this was the most surprising result to me, and I guess this is what brings us back around. We were talking about influence before, right? What I very strangely found, to my complete and utter surprise, was that when I genuinely relinquished control to the team, in the ways that I described, and I'm sure there's loads more ways, those are just the ways that I personally experimented with, is that my personal influence went up to the point where, with a team that I've been working on for less than 3 weeks, I genuinely felt I had control of the team. Not that I exercised control of the team, but my influence was such that I could implement practically any decision I thought fit. It was just really easy. I could have said, well, let's just do this, guys, and we would have done it. But it wasn't me personally. It was that those behaviors seemed to engender, the behaviors from the product managers seemed to engender the team's trust. And if they genuinely feel heard, and they're confident that the team is going to discuss, in fact, I'm not even sure what it is. This is my guess. But my guess is that the team builds a sense of trust in the product manager to the point where your job, because your influence goes up, your job becomes progressively easier, not harder. So I think that's my summary, which is that when you do this, the great irony of this is relinquishing control gives you more control because it's an influence job, and relinquishing control increases your influence to the point that you could practically exercise control. If you wanted to, I don't think you should, but it makes your job easy, which was amazing. It was amazing to me. Okay, so the summary of all that. Teams are really important. We probably underestimate how important they are. Someday in the future, organizations may just be based on teams, who knows? But the team is really important. And our success depends on them. Our role is influence-based. We're not individual contributors, although we'll talk about that more because maybe I haven't convinced you. We're not managers. We operate on influence, and we have to think about influence carefully and how we utilize it. And relinquishing control to the team increases your influence and thereby makes your role as a product manager easier and generally more successful. If you want to read more about the topic of relinquishing control and gaining influence as a result, this is a book I just found out about literally 2 days ago. So I'm not even all the way through it, but it's quite interesting. David Marquette is his name, is this guy. He was a commander of a US Navy submarine, and he did a year's training. He was assigned to command like a very high-profile, high-performing submarine in the US Navy, and he trained for a year to do it, and he was on his way to sort of assume the captaincy of that, and he got a message saying, like, you've been transferred to this other submarine, which was the worst submarine in the US Navy. And he had no knowledge of it. He hadn't trained, he didn't know how anything worked, and he had to basically go and take command. And the story is, I think of that song, Turn the Beat. So I think of a disco song when I see that title. But the story is how he turned that around, and his thesis is relinquishing control. So he did turn the submarine around, literally, and he did that by basically doing some of the things that we talked about. And he would probably talk about it much more, like he's probably developed a better framework than I have for that. But it's a really interesting read, and it might give you some more ideas about how you might do this and how you might apply it to your own work if you think that is something that would be useful to do. Yeah, it's a quite interesting story. So that is my talk.